Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into some serious philosophy? Today, we're tackling metaphysical realism.
We're going to be wrestling with some big ideas from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Yeah, we'll be exploring what metaphysical realism even means,
and why it matters.
and we'll lay out some of the arguments for and against it.
We're going to try and make this as clear as possible, though, because some of this stuff can get pretty abstract.
Definitely.
So think about this. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it still make a sound?
Okay, feel like that's a trick question. Of course it does.
Right. It seems pretty obvious. But that's the kind of question that metaphysical realists really grapple with.
Hmm. So it's not just about saying things exist, but like how they exist.
You got it. It's the idea that the world exists totally independent of our minds. Mind independently.
Mind independently. Okay, so that means the world, with all its stuff, exists whether we're aware of it or not.
Exactly. It's not something we create with our minds. It's not dependent on us observing it. It's just there.
It's just there. It has this fixed structure.
Okay, so how do philosophers even begin to prove that something exists mind independently?
Well, they use thought experiments, which can be kind of fun. Take Peter Van Inwagen, for example. He argues for the existence of numbers.
Numbers. Okay, I'm intrigued.
So he starts with the fact that objects in the world, have mass.
Right, mass and volume.
Right, exactly, which we can use to calculate density.
Density,
But
yeah.
to get density, you need ratios.
Oh, and ratios are.
Numbers.
Aha, numbers. So he's saying numbers have to exist because we need them to understand the physical world.
Exactly. But here's where things get a little tricky. His argument doesn't tell us if numbers exist in some, abstract realm.
Oh, I see. So Plato thought numbers existed in this separate, perfect world of forms.
Exactly. Independent of us, that's the Platonist view.
Yeah.
But then there's the intuitionist view.
Which says?
That numbers are just mental constructs.
Yeah.
That we create them. So two very different ways of thinking about numbers, both stemming from the same argument.
Right. So you can accept that numbers exist, but that doesn't automatically make you a metaphysical realist about them.
Okay, that's a really important point.
Because the core of this whole metaphysical realism debate is about whether things exist mind independently or not.
Got it. So are there any other examples that kind of show this whole mind-independent existence thing?
Yeah, definitely. Think about scientific realism.
Okay, scientific realism. Remind me what that is again?
So that's the view that the things described by our best scientific theories, like atoms, quarks, the laws of physics,
Right.
they actually exist.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here's the thing. You can actually be a scientific realist
And believe in atoms and all that.
without being a metaphysical realist.
Hold on, how does that work? If you think atoms are real, wouldn't you automatically be a metaphysical realist?
Not necessarily. See, you
Oh.
might believe that atoms are the best way to model reality, but that doesn't mean you think they exist mind independently. You might think they're useful,
Useful, but not necessarily real.
Exactly. They might just be theoretical tools to help us understand and predict things.
So, I could accept that atoms explain how the world works, but still be unsure if they're actually out there.
Exactly. It's about how we interpret those scientific models. And then you have things like factualism.
Factualism. What's that one about?
Factualism says that there are, mind-independent facts about the world.
Okay, that kind of sounds like metaphysical realism.
It does. But again, you could accept that there are facts without fully committing to metaphysical realism.
You mean maybe the facts are somehow dependent on our minds?
Right. Maybe they're tied to our language or our way of thinking.
Okay, so there are different levels of realism.
Yeah, totally.
But metaphysical realism is the strongest kind. The one that says the whole world is out there on its own.
Exactly. It's the most hardcore realism. And that position faces some really tough challenges. Well, one of them comes from language.
Language. How can language be a problem for metaphysical realism?
Well, think about how we use and learn words, right?
Okay.
We rely on these shared understandings and ways of justifying things. If I say, the sky is blue,
Right.
we all have this shared criteria for figuring out if that's true. But that criteria is based on, our agreement.
Our human agreement.
Yeah, our practices, our shared human perspective.
So the argument is that language is more about us and about some objective reality.
Exactly. And then that leads to the question of how language, which is so centered on humans, can connect to a mind-independent world.
That's a good point. It's like our words are tranked in our human world.
Right. And it's hard to see how they can reach out and touch the real world. And it gets even trickier when we think about how kids learn language.
Oh, yeah. How does that fit in?
Well, if meaning depends on this mind-independent world,
Hmm.
how do kids figure out what words mean if they can't always check if something is objectively true or not?
Right, because kids don't always have all the facts.
Exactly. It's like there's this gap between our words and what they're supposed to refer to in the world.
So how do realists explain that?
Well, we'll get into their responses in a bit. But first, there's another challenge I want to bring up.
Oh boy, bring it on. What else is there?
It's the brain in a vat problem. This is where things get really meta.
Okay, brain in a vat. That's like the classic Matrix idea, right?
Exactly. What if our reality is all just a simulation?
Whoa, Veep.
And the philosopher Hilary Putnam used this scenario to really challenge metaphysical realism.
Okay, how so?
He said that if we were brains in a vat, we couldn't even think the thought, I am a brain in a vat.
Wait, why not? If I were a brain in a vat, I feel like I could still think that thought.
Well, Putnam's argument hinges on this idea called semantic externalism.
Semantic externalism.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. It's the idea that the meaning of our words is partly determined by our interaction with the actual world.
So if we're brains in a vat, our words don't refer to the same things.
Right, like my word tree would refer to a simulated tree, not a real one. So Putnam argued that a brain in a vat couldn't genuinely think, I'm a brain in a vat, because their words wouldn't be grounded in the real world.
So it's like the very idea of being a brain in a vat undermines the language we'd need to describe it.
Exactly. It creates this weird kind of incoherence for the metaphysical realist.
Whoa. So if metaphysical realism is true, and it's possible we could be brains in a vat,
Yeah.
but we couldn't even think about it. That's a problem.
You got it. It throws a big wrench in their whole system, and believe it or not, there are even more challenges coming up, but we'll save those for part 2.
My brain is already in a pretzel. I can't wait to hear how metaphysical realism tried to climb out of these philosophical holes.
Yeah, those were some pretty heavy arguments against metaphysical realism.
You really were.
But the realists haven't exactly thrown in the towel.
Okay, good, because I have to admit, part of me still wants to believe there's a world out there, one that exists whether I'm thinking about it or not.
Right. It's a compelling idea.
So how do realists try to address these challenges?
Well, let's start with that whole language issue. Remember the anti-realists say our language is just based on these human agreements?
Yeah, so it's hard to see how it connects with, like, actual objective reality.
Right, exactly. So one way realists respond is by emphasizing the simplicity of truth.
Simplicity of truth. Okay, I'm listening.
They say truth is a really basic concept. Saying grass is green is true. It's just another way of saying grass is green.
So they're saying don't overthink it.
Basically, they argue there's no need to make it more complicated than it is.
So truth is just matching words to reality.
Exactly. And they also point out that it's strange to say a concept is meaningless just because we can't always be sure if it applies.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of concepts we use where we can't always be 100% certain.
Right. Like, I can talk about justice, but I can't always definitively prove if something's just or unjust.
Okay, that's a good example.
We don't just throw out concepts like justice or beauty just because we can't always perfectly define them.
So simplicity and accepting some uncertainty, that's part of the realist response.
Yep. And they've got another big argument up their sleeve.
Which is?
The success of science.
Oh, right. Science is all about figuring out how the world works.
Exactly. And it does a pretty darn good job of it.
It does.
Realists say this success really backs up their view, because if the world wasn't mind-independent, why would science be so good at, figuring it out?
That makes sense. If science is uncovering these truths about the world,
then there must be a world out there to discover, right?
Yeah, seems logical.
But of course, anti-realists have a counter to that too.
They always do. What's their argument?
Well, they say that science works because it gives us the tools to predict and control the world.
Okay.
It's more about what works, not necessarily about finding the true nature of things.
So science is giving us useful models, not necessarily a perfect reflection of reality.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction.
It is. Okay, so we've got simplicity, uncertainty, and the success of science. What about that language acquisition problem? How do realists explain how kids learn language if it's supposed to be tied to this mind-independent world they can't always access?
Right. Well, realists often point to compositionality.
Compositionality.
It means we learn the meaning of sentences by building them up from the meaning of individual words and how they're put together.
Oh, so it's like learning the rules of grammar.
Exactly. It's like building with Legos. You start with the individual pieces,
Of words.
and then grammar shows you how to combine them.
To make sentences.
And even really complex ideas. And realists argue that even those sentences with truth conditions we can't always check, like the one about Socrates sneezing,
Right, we can't go back in time to verify that.
we can still understand them because of compositionality.
So the meaning is in the structure, not necessarily in our ability to prove it.
That's the idea.
Okay, I think I'm following. What about that brain in a vat thing? That still seems like a major hurdle for realists.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. There are a few different ways realists try to handle it.
Okay, lay them on me.
Some realists just flat out deny it's even possible to be a brain in a vat.
They just say, nope, can't happen.
Pretty much. They might argue that the whole concept is incoherent or relies on a misunderstanding of how minds and language work.
Okay, so that's one approach. Just dismiss the scenario entirely.
Right. Another is to go after semantic externalism.
That word again. So if we reject the idea that our words get their meaning from our interaction with the real world,
Then Putnam's argument loses its bite.
because a brain in a vat could still think, I'm a brain in a vat, even if vat doesn't refer to a real vat.
You got it.
Clever.
But I think the most interesting response is the one that tries to tackle that supposed contradiction head on.
You mean the idea that it's contradictory to say both, that we could be brains in a vat, and that if we were, we couldn't think we were?
Exactly. Some realists argue there's actually no real contradiction there.
How so?
Well, they say it's just a matter of different possibilities and what we can know within each of those possibilities.
So in one possibility, we're not brains in a vat, and we can think all sorts of thoughts. And in another possibility, we are brains in a vat, but we can't think that thought.
Right. It's like saying, it's possible I'll win the lottery, but if I did, I might never know because I lost the ticket.
Oh, that's a good analogy. No contradiction, just different scenarios.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered those three big challenges. What about that model theoretic argument? That one seemed pretty technical.
Yeah, it is. But remember, the basic idea is that there are just too many ways to match up our language with the world.
Leading to uncertainty about what our words refer to.
Right. Or the possibility that even a perfect theory could be false.
And neither of those are good for metaphysical realism. So what do they say?
One way they push back is to say that even a perfect model doesn't necessarily capture everything about the world. Even if the model makes all the sentences of a theory true, it doesn't mean that the terms in the model are picking out the right things.
It's like having a map that's perfectly drawn, but all the street names are wrong.
Exactly.
So it's accurate in a way, but not really connected to reality.
Right. Realists argue that we need an extra constraint.
A right reference constraint. To make sure our words are hooked up to the right stuff in the world.
Exactly. But of course that raises the question of how we know we've got the right reference.
Which brings us back to square one. How do we bridge that gap between language and a mind-independent reality?
You got it. It's the million-dollar question.
All right, so what about that last challenge? Conceptual schemes and pluralism.
Ah, yes. Remember, that argument says that our understanding of the world is shaped by these conceptual schemes.
And different schemes might describe the same reality in different conflicting ways.
Like with those different theories of space-time.
Right. Some focusing on points, others on regions.
So the question is, which one is right?
Or are they both describing the same reality in different ways?
Exactly. And that's where the debate gets heated. Some realists say that this conceptual pluralism doesn't actually threaten metaphysical realism.
Because the different schemes are just different ways of describing the same underlying reality.
Right, like using different languages to talk about the same object.
Okay, so the schemes are compatible, just different perspectives.
That's one way to look at it. But other realists worry that this makes reality too subjective, you know?
Too dependent on how we think about it.
Exactly. They argue there must be a way to judge between different schemes.
To see which one is the most accurate representation of the mind-independent world.
You got it. But figuring out how to do that, that's another ongoing debate.
It seems like this all boils down to that fundamental question. How do we know our ways of thinking are actually connected to reality?
You're absolutely right. It's the core issue.
Yeah.
And it's a tough one to crack.
It really is. So are realists saying that even with all these challenges, their view is still the best we've got?
That's what they're arguing. They say that despite all these complexities, metaphysical realism is still the most practical approach. the one that makes the most sense of how we actually experience the world.
Okay, so what other arguments do they use to defend their position? All right, we're back for the final round of our metaphysical realism deep dive. Last time, we left off with the realists trying to defend their view against those tough challenges.
And you know philosophers, they don't give up easily.
Nope. So I'm guessing those anti-realists have some counter-arguments ready to go.
Oh, absolutely. They've got some pretty sharp responses to those realist defenses we talked about.
All right, let's hear them. So realists love to pull out Occam's razor, right? The whole simplest explanation is usually best thing.
Right, simplicity is a big deal for them.
But how do anti-realists respond to that?
Well, they might say that simplicity isn't the only thing that matters.
Okay, fair enough. What else should we consider?
Sometimes a more complex explanation actually gets us closer to the truth, especially when we're talking about something as intricate as, the mind and the world and how they connect.
It's like those super simplified models of the universe, right?
Yeah,
Elegant, but they probably miss a lot of important details.
exactly. And anti-realists argue that their views, while maybe a bit more complex, actually take into account a wider range of philosophical issues.
Like what?
Well, things like the role of language, the nature of knowledge, and the limits of what we can actually understand.
So it's not just about being simple, it's about being comprehensive.
Right. It's about having a theory that can really grapple with all these different facets of the problem.
Makes sense. Okay, what about that common sense argument? Realists often say that most people just naturally lean towards metaphysical realism.
Right. It seems intuitive, but anti-realists push back against that pretty hard.
No, so.
Well, they question whether common sense is always a reliable guide to truth. They point to all those times in history when common sense turned out to be totally wrong.
Oh, yeah, like thinking the Earth was flat.
Exactly. We've definitely been wrong before.
Yeah, not our finest hour.
And anti-realists say that common sense is often shaped by our limited perspective, and all sorts of cultural biases.
So what seems obvious to us might not actually be true.
Right. And they also point out that even if most people do lean towards metaphysical realism, that doesn't make it automatically true.
Right. Popularity doesn't equal truth.
Exactly.
Okay, so even common sense has to be scrutinized. But what about the realists' big gun, the success of science? I mean, that's got to be some pretty strong evidence for their view, right?
You'd think so. But anti-realists have a pretty clever response to that one, too.
Really? What is it?
They argue that the success of science is actually more consistent with their view of the world.
Wait, hold on. I thought science was all about discovering objective truths, which seems to fit perfectly with metaphysical realism. How could anti-realists possibly claim that science supports them?
Well, they argue that science works so well because it helps us make accurate predictions, and control the world around us. It's a pragmatic tool.
So it's not necessarily giving us the ultimate truth about reality.
That's the anti-realist claim. They say science doesn't need to tell us how the world really is, just how it behaves.
So it's like saying we don't need to know what gravity really is to build airplanes. We just need a model that lets us predict how things will fall.
Perfect analogy. Some anti-realists even go so far as to say that the whole idea of a mind-independent reality is itself just a kind of conceptual scheme.
Wow, okay. So they're really questioning the whole foundation of metaphysical realism. That's pretty radical.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us? If we give up on metaphysical realism, what do anti-realists offer in its place?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and the answer is, it depends. Anti-realism isn't one unified position, but more like a family of different views.
Okay, what kind of views?
Well, some lean towards idealism, the idea that reality is ultimately mental. Others prefer a more pragmatic approach, focusing on what works, rather than getting hung up on absolute truth. And then there are those who explore alternative metaphysical frameworks, like the kinds of ideas you find in Eastern philosophies or indigenous cosmologies.
So anti-realism isn't so much giving us the answer as opening up a whole bunch of new questions and possibilities.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole debate so fascinating. It really forces us to confront those fundamental assumptions we have about the world and our place in it.
Well, it's definitely been a mind-bending journey. So after all this back and forth, is there a clear winner between metaphysical realism and anti-realism?
I think if you were hoping for a knockout punch, you're going to be disappointed. This
Yeah.
is one of those debates that's been going on for centuries, and it's probably not going away anytime soon.
Figures. It wouldn't be philosophy if there were easy answers.
Right. But even though there's no clear winner, I think engaging with this debate helps us understand how we relate to the world in a much more nuanced way.
I agree. It pushes us to really examine our assumptions and
Yeah.
to consider different perspectives.
Exactly. And to appreciate the depth and complexity of these really fundamental questions, questions we often take for granted.
Well said. This deep dive has really made me think. I started out feeling like metaphysical realism was so obvious, but now I see it's a lot more complicated and interesting than I first thought. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after this deep dive?
I think the main thing is to stay open to the conversation, you know? Don't feel like you have to pick a side or come up with all the answers.
Yeah, keep those philosophical wheels turning.
Exactly. Embrace the mystery, embrace the uncertainty, and enjoy the challenge of wrestling with these questions about the nature of reality.
Love it. So to all our listeners out there, keep those philosophical minds buzzing. And remember, the world might be a lot weirder and more wonderful than we often assume. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.